All right. Okay, so everyone be 32? No?
No, it's only one.
Plus 10 on your notes today.
32. Plus 10?
Yeah, get a little extra credit there.
What's in the box?
So, yeah, I'll admit it's not the actual activity is not to check, but I thought I had this big box. It's incredibly oversized for the amount of things that are actually in it. And I feel really bad because I have like most of the class here, so we should have done something like real like with everyone. I have only enough stuff to where what we normally have is about 5 students who show up every day. So what'll end up happening is I'll put those on the Elmo as opposed to like have it interacting or whatever instead. So you'll still do the activity. But I thought about this because there's this experiment, an interesting psychology experiment in which they have children. And they give a box to children and adults. They have the same amount of boxes. It's a small box, actually a really tiny box, not this big one. This is more caricature, but it's a tiny box. And they ask a number, like 5-minute periods. They give it a little more time. Adults versus children. Adults can think of maybe 30 things. How many things do you think a child can think of? Over 100. Over 100 things in the same amount of time that it takes an adult to think of. 34, children can think of 100. So it's often an interesting psychology experiment about the question the child asking interesting questions like, well, if the horse was miniature, this is a tiny horse, it could fit in there. So they have this infinite number of possibilities because their creativity has not been bound by our understandings of science. But remember, we talked about what our definition of science is that you should still be kind of bubbling around with from those quotes that I gave 2 weeks ago about what science is, and what it isn't is a dry set of facts. I don't think I have it on this slide, but I have it on the next one. About science and reason. In fact, I'll just flip over there just now as soon as I can find my...
It's in your pocket.
Yeah, it's right here. Science is not just a devoid presentation of facts. It's not just a presentation of cold facts. There's creativity involved. And we talked about Einstein and how he presented science almost in an artistic, if not poetic way. And in many of our characters, remember, in our Symphony of Science, Autotune, song, had a lot of real literary type ways in which they described what science is. And so to think about that experiment in that regard is a little different. Children have an unpiqued curiosity of the world and can think outside, literally, of the box. But I can't because I only have a few things in here, and I don't know if it'll help us or not to think of this experiment. This was one that was done actually in my credentialing class, and I thought it was interesting, so I kind of stole it, the idea of it, for you guys. It was an introduction that he has to a particular topic in science, so I want to share that with you in a moment. We'll come back to this slide and the idea of science and reason in a moment. In your iPad, though, what I'd like you guys to do, I'm going to turn this on so that we can see everything together very clearly on the board here. What I'd like us to do is, I have objects in this box. I'm not sure how many. That's something that you'll need to observe. In the course of looking at these things, I want you to create discernible patterns. What you think might, how you might list these out if you were to have to list them out. And then we'll consider each other's lists in a moment. So you got to list them out based upon what you see in this, and if we can kind of line them up in a way that makes some sort of sense. I don't know what that sense is. Again, that purpose you'll have to describe yourself. Are you ready? Or some type of pattern or object pattern or something. You're creating a pattern where I place these objects. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Best it can. All right. And so there's no right or wrong answer to this. There is just, however, your analysis of the process. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh no.
For this thing here. They're not specialty items. They're simple items, but they will be presented in interesting ways. So here we go. I'm going to put a couple of these things out. You need to look at them very closely. Okay, look at them very closely here.
Is it like a rubber band?
It is. What is that?
Oh, it's right around
Look at them very closely
It is
here.
wrapped around my neck.
Okay, what we're doing is we're making a track.
Why, both of us?
I'll make sure this one looks different than the one that we have previously. So they're all supposed to be unique items
for
here.
whatever was inside the box.
They're supposed to be unique items. Okay. Here we go.
Did you say they're in stagecraft?
No.
What is that? What's that white thing?
White.
It's a piece of paper.
Some of them are.
Hey, let's go.
Yeah,
Hey,
put
Mr.
this one
Morris.
down here.
Can I be included in that like theory of knowledge text? I never get those.
What?
The theory of knowledge text.
You probably weren't here.
Oh, maybe you weren't here when I did the Mind 101. Email me and I'll give you the code.
Awesome.
All right, there are your items here. This is again a biology teacher who spent time in South America. This was a lesson that he presented to us, so it's not me just making crap up, I swear. Making you do something weird. Let me just send that one. Very well. I think that's complete now. So here you go. So now I want you to create some sort of listing of items in some sort of discernible pattern that you can find in this. I'm going to give you guys about 3 minutes to do so.
Wait,
So look at these items here and describe what you see. Tell me what you see. See how you can distinguish each item from each other, and then give me a discernible pattern. So those are the two things.
Can they all be?
So again, no right or wrong answer, just try it out and we'll talk about it. If you're totally confused, okay, write something. God, you guys
Can
are
they all
smart.
be
Do something
together?
right.
Can they all be in the
They are
same
objects you
pattern?
find at Staples.
Yes, they all need to be a part of some sort of pattern. Some timeline maybe, or something. I don't know. You can think about how you categorizing. I don't want to give too much away. I want you just to come at it fresh. Go.
Do we have to like list them, or can we just
3
have
minutes.
categories?
You can find it in one of the shelves.
List. You can list them out and then maybe categorize them however you find, group them, whatever.
But do we have to
Like-
like pencil one, crayon one, like? Can we
Yeah, if
have-
you need to do that, and kind of change just make a description of them. Maybe give them a name.
Objects you could find in a home.
I don't think
I'm gonna even put this right here too. Kind of throw it in.
What is that?
I was thinking writing.
It's my
Writing utensils.
They are objects you
Things
could find.
that are so
I think he's trying to create a
Okay,
pattern.
what do you mean?
I don't know what to say.
They're objects with which the actor can,
I don't care.
Mr. Morris is a hat camera.
I don't know.
When I'm young and famous, I'll give you that.
Is that you?
Too late for that.
What's that tool called in the middle?
I don't know. I don't know. This is you.
This is you.
Make it up. Be that child. You're unbound by what you think these things are. Be that child who can think of 100 things in a box. Yes.
Forming them into a pattern or categorizing them.
Either one. That's what I mean by pattern. Well, what pattern can you find?
Empty chairs. Where am I?
Write them out.
you could make like a
Brody, write them out. You have 2 minutes.
I put what's in the box.
To make a catapult,
Paper clips, rubber bands, tangles, paper balls, pens, crayons, pencils.
Okay.
And then I put what I see, and then I put what I saw, then I put what the purpose is.
Okay, that's cool. So hold on to those. We'll
Video camera.
Okay, they
Yellows.
And I put the
you can make a
purpose.
sculpture.
Nothing over here.
Make a sculpture.
Coffee.
If I could get a bucket full of
Yeah, we some green we're up in here.
Dig your pencils into
What?
do what you want, you're never gonna break me. Sticks and stones, you're never gonna shake me. You can unravel the
Anyone else?
and you can make like
Coffee. Haley. Haley.
Oh wait, I actually have a mug that
Do you want more?
What if you made a fire? You built,
Anyone else need coffee? Got the cup right here while you're thinking about your
and then you
wonderful activity right now. Think about it.
You melted the crayons.
a factory.
You melted the crayons, and then
Who even watches
then
You guys
this?
gotta donate a creamer if you want it.
as a Kindle thing, you melt the crayons and you drip it all over the stuff and you make it into a pattern.
He doesn't mind.
And then
He said sex in front of me.
Tina.
I don't know how good it is.
Josh.
find these on the desk.
Just
As an engineer,
Smells kind of bitter. Sorry. Hey, Tina. Go away.
Who watches that except for us?
I don't know. Dude, Blake does. Blake does a great job.
Hi, Blake!
one of the highest grades on the test and hasn't been to a single class.
What did I get on my test?
He has to watch this one.
I don't even know
Like,
what he
is
looks
everyone
like.
watching?
You don't know what he looks like?
No, I've never seen
You've
him.
never seen, he's like tall and blonde and skinny and awkward.
What he's gonna see.
He knows this. I am
What did I
describing
get on my
him.
test? You never sent me my grade. It's on.
Okay,
It's on the,
it's been a good 3 minutes. Let's progress, Mr. Morris.
Thank you so much. Okay, now I would like you to have 2 minutes to discuss it with your team, whoever your team is for reading, so do that now. I want you to try and take with that community of people some type of consensus about what in fact is going on with our list of what seemingly is random office supplies.
We actually
What
did
is
that
the
already.
design,
I was right.
feature, or
Office supplies.
pattern involved with this?
I don't get what you mean by pattern.
Like the grouping.
That's what I want you to tell me.
Did you build a house out of it?
Office supplies.
Well, I
Build a house and like make
Mr. Morris.
Yes.
The walls, I put like children materials and middle school and high school materials and elder like Sharpie.
From Nostro with a question here.
I put like children materials for like schooling, for like
That's
the
the most
crayons,
relevant question.
and then middle and high school.
It took me a while to consider what I wanted the aesthetic to look like when I listed them out, yes. And maybe my own bias in terms of both randomness, but also wanting to create avenues to see patterns, to actually see patterns.
We should have
You can
No, I do not have
That's like on Facebook.
Yeah, if the question is if there's a right or wrong answer, the answer is yes.
There is a right or wrong answer?
There is a right or wrong answer.
Girlfriend.
If there is a right and or wrong answer, the answer is no, there's no right or wrong.
But there's a right answer.
There's both right and wrong answers. Simultaneous duality.
Things to hold the
She's about to get weird right now.
Morris, keep your distance away from her.
Keep back this into women.
She's the next Courtney Hill.
Have something to consider with the group, please. 1 minute.
What I don't like, what came in, I would say.
I'm giving you way more time than what I anticipated.
What if it was like a little girl and she had a
Yeah.
Oh my god. Who's missing? Blanford?
Ricky.
Tyler Smalley, Tyler Carrington.
Oh, I totally thought Carrington was passing here.
Same here, he doesn't have. Does Carrington like actually do
I thought he was not doing that.
Don't worry about it. Don't talk about students. People are watching.
Hi guys. We're in class.
Okay.
Where are you?
A lot more students than I'm used to. That's great though. I enjoy it. I love you all, by the way.
Ew.
What?
This is like 2nd grade.
Leo, look it.
You're talking about my just called the teacher.
You just called the teacher.
Dad.
Because he was like, because I'm here. And
I
like,
did that once.
but it's split up on the table. Oh no, we were talking about him.
They weren't talking
We were
about
talking about you.
Oh, I hear you.
Mr. Morris, I'm waiting to you. Just say hi.
Sorry.
Brody was like, he's having everybody's here. And then Brody's like, because I'm here. And like, we're up on the table. And then like,
I saw it now, but I thought that you was like, really? It was good timing.
Bill, yes you are.
All right, let's come back and kind of debrief this real quick and figure out what I'm even asking, because I'm pretty sure you're confused. You want to start on this side? Tell us a little bit about the patterns and or whatever you found about observing these objects, seemingly in random.
I did 3 categories. One
Okay.
is writing utensils.
Okay,
It has crayons and the pencil and the pens.
good.
And then I did hardware, and it has the drill bit thing. I think it's
Hardware. What is hardware?
like metal.
Okay, so something that different, so some sort of different material, also different functions. So there's something about function going on.
And
Okay.
then the last one is classroom materials. So like
Classroom materials,
paper
like what?
clips, paper wad, rubber bands, presentation paper.
Okay, what do you know about? Yeah, go ahead.
Why are writing utensils not in classroom?
Because I was just more specific.
So something's like there's like okay, so there's a specificity to your categories. Some of them are writing utensils, but they're different than, according to your system, the other types of miscellaneous supplies. I wonder if there's something that we can do to respond or perhaps critique her classification. For instance, what do you notice about these quote-unquote classroom materials? Do they work? Do they function as classroom materials in their current form?
Yes.
It depends on what you're using them for. That's a really interesting qualification then. Depends on what you're using it for. Is this what you normally see classroom materials used for?
Yes.
And
Being put into box.
and
Please
maybe
tell us, enlighten us, Kyle.
Well,
Caleb.
Caleb, sorry, but I don't know.
if you are bored and you have such materials on your desk and you're bored, you could use them to create
I did that today.
stuff.
Okay, so do you have a system in which you've categorized it in that way or no?
We have.
What, with a personality or?
We have a lot of different things. We have.
Okay, enlighten us. Talk to us a little
Yes,
bit.
we
That was a
do.
pretty
We
good
do.
start.
You were not.
Pretty good start. The idea of different materials based
Ours-
upon their function. Yes.
Ours don't really follow logical. We have a movie where those are props
Yeah.
for a movie,
Okay.
and there's like a little kid, and he has like there's a drawing with the green ones, and then there's like an older people working with pencils, and then there's
So there's
older
time-
and they're working with the
You
pens.
can also find
And
Oh, mind blown right now.
that's what I said. This is what I
There's
told
like
him.
evolution going on right now.
and then
I put like children's materials,
No,
like
because it
the
goes like you
crayons.
start off with like before like we use a pencil, use like the metal, then we go second,
What?
then use a pencil.
Well, now that's an
Okay.
interesting addition because hers is much more. I would say if I were to put it in a TOK system, literary. It's a story that you're kind of creating, literature. You develop this based upon a story that there is a beginning, middle, and end, right? I'm assuming with your characters. So it starts off as a child,
Then he
moves through
grows
different
up
writing
and
utensils. What about
first
these?
he has the metal and the rubber bands, and he just plays with
He's
them. 'cause
playing with them.
he's
So
like,
this isn't so much the object itself, but maybe as through an artistic lens. It's the like we call line. Do you guys know what line is in art?
yeah.
What is it in math?
A line?
What is a line?
It's an unending point.
It's a never-ending point or a segment. I should say a segment.
I got it.
Specific one.
No.
A segment is what?
Segment's not a line.
It's the distance between what? 2 points
It's like
on a plane, right? In art, if I were to use the word segment, or I should say line, it would be a best definition for line in art is a record of movement. A record of movement. So it's very different use of the same thing that's created. So one person might see this as the material sort of bundled up. Another person might see this artistically as in the record of movement. This is in fact a movement element here because you'd have to have someone's hands. It's a record of how someone's hands manipulated that object, i.e. Mr. Morris. So I'd be that young boy starting off with his crayons and building up towards these weird like things for his TOK class. Okay, so very literary and artistic. So you can see the little difference. You got function, you got the utility. We have
Wait, so was I wrong?
literary / artistic line and movement. Very good. Now, Rhodey, you had something to add to that because you thought that they were going in one direction. They might not have been. Please tell us a little bit about what you just said.
Oh, I don't know why what he said, but I thought it was like you start off not like just diddly daddling with like the rubber bands and,
No, keep going.
and the paper clips, and then you work your way up to a crayon, and then you work your way up to a pencil, then the pens and the pointer, and then you're a teacher.
So you're kind of going so you're going in the different direction because it seemed like she started down here, but you're starting up here and moving down maybe through them, but you're still dealing with time, which is why yours is similar, but you had a different thing. You were talking about these being much less what? Sophisticated?
Yeah.
Manufactured? I don't know. Could we say it as such? Does this have a sense of which ones, I'll say this right now, which ones look like they have the hallmarks of design?
Clicker.
Oh, the clicker has the most sophisticated design, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Why?
Because all digital.
Because that digital technology. So that was an easy one. Once I threw that in there, it seemed to understand that this is in a category of its own, correct? Could we at least say that? So we at least could all come to consensus that whatever it is, this is in a category of its own, right? Okay. What do all of them have in common?
They're all sexy.
They
They all have a form of metal in them.
They all could have maybe some metal in
Or
them,
like no,
except
some
for
natural
the,
material.
right, something about natural materials. So yes, they are matter. They are made of
I
carbon.
just changed my answer.
They all have atoms in them.
You could find them at Staples.
You can find them at Staples, which means they're what? We said office supplies, various levels of office supplies, which is fine. We could kind of break them down, like you said, writing utensils or whatever. What if I were required to then take this and put them in a line, a timeline, perhaps? What would that look like?
That's what we did.
Yes, go ahead.
We did chronological order of like which came first.
Ooh, which one came first? Do you kind of see where I'm going with this project a little bit? Good. Go ahead.
So we did paper first.
Paper.
And
See
then
that paper?
and then things to write on the paper, and then we did the pencil, and then the crayons, and then the pen, and then the mechanical pencil.
Okay.
And then things to hold the paper, so the paper clip, the rubber band.
So these are actually, in your view, these are more complex than something like this, perhaps, or even like this, right? These might be simple, what we call simple machines, right? Hardware, like an eye bolt, does something to hold something up.
Did it have a string in that?
It's a simple machine as opposed to something like this, which might have a different, a little bit more movable parts. Are you anticipating kind of what this assignment is? If I were to tell you then that this was created, like I said, by a biology teacher to teach something in class, what do you think? And you had said the key word before, evolution. Okay, this is one of those controversial hot button topics that I'm assuming you learn about in biology class, I'm assuming. If the teacher is brave or whatever that might be, to talk about evolution. And what's interesting is that there were some weaknesses to this activity that we discussed in class regarding evolution. Because here I've asked you to make categories of things. How does that relate or resemble science? The idea of categorizing. Do you do that in biology?
Yeah.
The Linnaean, right? Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus.
Yeah.
And his whole system of classifying flora. You have your animal and plant and whatever others. What was the other one?
Proctista.
Yeah, Proctista.
No, there's archaeobacteria, bacteria.
And okay.
Eukaryotes.
But that's all part of
That's the top one.
top.
And there's kingdom, class.
Okay. So Linnaeus is an interesting system. He comes out of a particular worldview, and we still think it's functional today to categorize creatures, right? You often hear like the zoo, they'll be like, the panda is a distant cousin of the grizzly bear, or something like that. Or the raccoon, that's what it is, you're right. Panda is the distant, you're like, come on. Thought you hear, Panda Owl on Animal Planet, talk about it. Pandas, you're right, pandas are distant cousins of the raccoon. That's what, so we hear this like, these language that we use, these approximations of families, right? Families. Could this be considered a family line, family tree?
Oh.
Well, we kind of go, well, there's certain problems with that. What's the biggest problem with assembling these and trying to make them resemble or analogize these to things like biological evolution? There's a key word there.
They don't have cells.
They don't have cells?
They aren't living.
No, they're not living.
Yeah.
They're living.
Yeah, they don't have molecules.
They're not living, okay? So there's a dead quality to it, which means they don't do what? What's an example of something that's
Move.
living?
Reproduce.
They don't reproduce. So that's a main problem. So here's the question. When we are talking about biology, and
on their own.
in particular, we can talk about those. If we're talking about biological evolution,
Yeah, they do.
does it make sense, or is it functional or helpful to talk about non-living things as approximations or analogies to living things? Have you ever heard, for instance, the analogy of the watchmaker? Paley's watchmaker. What does anyone know what I'm talking about at all? You find a watch in the beach, and you are to look at it, and you to lift the watch in your hand, and you're to look at the fine detail of the watch face and the clock hands and the gears, and it seems to, as you wind it up, it still needs something to wind it up. It has this intense intricacy that couldn't be anything else but what? when you look at it? Do you think, oh, this was kind of falling into random chance, that these letters and this pigment and these gears work to build itself together in this perfect way? And it's often used as an analogy from the 19th century to do what, you think?
Creationism.
That design is implicit in biological machines, i.e. people. The question and the challenge to that is it proper to use non-living things to describe living things? And we can maybe say yes, no, maybe so, something in between. But that's an interesting TOK question. Could I explore this topic using analogy? Another one, tornado turning into a 747. You have a lot of the materials of a 747 and they all kind of assemble together in a seemingly chaotic way to create such a functional machine. This is the main argument behind things like intelligent design. Have you ever heard of Michael Behe and his pursuit of irreducible complexity? It's a new form of what would be an older version of creationism, in that there is a high probability, there's a high improbability that simple machines cannot function without parts missing. Okay, so this is the foundation of a lot of the controversy that you hear about what ID is, intelligent design, versus evolution, or something along those lines. It would be a topic that you'd want to maybe touch on or explore in your science versus science and religion Socratic seminar, to talk about that theme. Beyond that, we can maybe think about what kinds of assembly can we do with this? What timeline? If I were to tell you now that you had to do it in an evolutionary way, could you tell us what the first, starting, second, third, could you put them together? What other questions would you have to ask in order to make it fit an evolutionary paradigm? What is, huh?
Found in nature, just like the crayons are waxy, so that's just found in.
Okay, so maybe some that are more connected to natural objects as opposed to more manufactured ones, even though aren't crayons manufactured, but they might be less so there might be more of a primary structure and then secondary structures. You'd also look at function. How do they function together? What is the function of this together? Does this seem like randomness, or does it sound... And what is the difference between, if we're looking at a real, if we're trying to be real consistent here, what is the difference between atoms that are turning into rocks versus atoms that turn into raccoons, or babies, or adults? Those are important questions to how to categorize the star stuff, to use the language of our poets, our science poets. The star stuff, that matter that's in the earth, it collaborates in different ways. What makes one better than the other, or different than the other, or more valuable than the other, or more beautiful than the other, or more rational than the other? Which ones come early, which ones come later? How do we know that? So things like age, how old things are. If I were to tell you to do that, could you tell me which one could be older than the others? Is there a way to describe that? You could at least eliminate one of them as being the newest potential technology, right? Which is what? That clicker, right? Would definitely be seemingly on the high end of things. So we can kind of do that. What do all of these things, if I were to say, is there a designer to these things? Whatever these are, this assembly of matter. Could you say that there was a designer involved with these?
Yes.
Why?
Because they all have a shape.
Because they're all the shape of them?
No.
Huh? How do you know that they are man-made?
Design them.
Because they don't occur naturally.
How do you know that they don't occur naturally in nature?
Because we haven't observed being created.
Okay, now you're thinking like a scientist. You have not seen rubber bands occur in nature. It seems to be because you have an intimate knowledge of the designer, i.e. human beings, that you can make that decision. The question is, can you say the same about the universe? Okay, so this is that challenge, again, that science and religion have about whether or not they have information about the design of the universe. Okay? So your biggest people that contrast these two things would be someone like David Hume on miracles. He talks about that very perspective. You could also talk about the anthropic principle, which is a little bit similar, in that the whole universe is designed for us in mind. Okay, is that possible? Are we, in fact, the pinnacle of creation? Or is there something else going on? Those are the interactions that you often hear, it's so often too much clash as opposed to converse on this issue of science and religion. Yes?
You said like one of their main things is we can't say it's from nature because we haven't observed the structure of the universe. And how can they say the same thing about the pinnacle if we don't know enough about the universe?
Well, I think one side would be saying we don't have enough information to observe these types of objects in nature.
The religious side.
No, the religious side would not say that necessarily. The religion, and I don't want to stereotype everything, but in general it would be that there would be a side that is skeptical of our ability to understand a designer involved with, I guess, biological machines versus the side that would say that there is special knowledge, there's something separate, there's something not necessarily observable in a scientific way, but nonetheless important. But here's your challenge right there. So the way I've just phrased that, do you catch it? Say it again. The side who is not, who stereotyped as the religious side, believes that there's something that maybe isn't scientific, like some sort of special knowledge, but is no less important. Is that possible? To have knowledge that is not necessarily scientific knowing, but is no less important, or valuable, or in fact knowledge. The challenge was 2 weeks ago to ask you to talk about those various cultural clashes. Did you remember that? The cultural clash. In fact, one of these papers is one of those cultural clashes that I had you guys do. If you weren't here and you didn't watch the video, one of them, for instance, this one is about the evolution. You teach evolution in classrooms. But other ones had to do with being a scientist during the Holocaust. You freeze people in order to learn about frostbite and hypothermia. And do we use that knowledge in the future, even though it's done through ill-gotten or immoral gains? The question is that can you defend ethical procedures in science from a purely scientific basis, or do you appeal to something else? That's an interesting question. Does ethics derive from science? Does everything derive to science, or is there something separate? Now the TOK model already gives us divisions of those things, but I want you to challenge those divisions and make positions. I want you to argue something in defense. You have in your Socratic seminars you should have some sort of article that you're reading, a position that you're taking, a thesis statement, some aspect of how science and religion interact or clash or synthesize or something in order to discuss in class. Let it be somewhat controversial so we can have good conversation. That's Wednesday. So make sure you have something to describe to us. Have maybe 2 people in your group take a position, 2 people have another position separate. Have a conversation. Have preset questions and answers for each other. And then we can introduce that topic to the outside group and have that whole conversation. Anything you want in that topic. Go through that system. It's online already. If you haven't already been working on it the whole week, you should be doing that within the next couple days. Okay? So that's very important. All right, so you see how this was kind of interesting or relevant? Okay, good. I'm glad that it's an introduction to that idea of science and religion and or how controversial or, I don't know, interesting. Because what I'm telling you to look at it through a certain paradigm, am I? Because, hey, do that evolution through an evolution paradigm is not evolution a paradigm. It's a set of beliefs to understand the world the best way we can think of it. Is evolution, I'm thinking of the long scope type, the best way to think about how matter exists in this universe, constructed and particularly biological structures. All right, well, I'm just trying to figure out where my clicker is, and it was in the evolutionary timeline there. I pulled it out there. All right, and part of this then is science as a system of knowledge that you tell other people. So right now, for instance, we're talking about the philosophy of science, which should kind of be its own class. It's kind of sad that it's not. I offer that, I told you guys I had a seminar class where I did theology and science, and that was sort of, we had 2 different teachers. I had a quantum physicist teacher, and I actually had a Christian philosophy teacher who was a pastor and that sort of thing himself. And they had these really interesting dialogues in class. And one of the things that I had offered in my own research, and you might find it useful, is part of those clashes that go on in science and religion might often result in the fact that we don't have a course where we can simply have that conversation, which you're about to do on Wednesday. So I'd offer to say, well, in an education curriculum in the high school years, why not have a philosophy of science course where you can just open that theory up? Because it really might not work to do it in a biology class, to have that conversation. I don't know if it's useful to do that. You can disagree with me. But it might be useful in a philosophy class. And part of the thing that you would ask in a philosophy class is what science is. Again, is it just a presentation devoid of value, of a list of facts? That's something I wanted to challenge you on last week. I was or 2 weeks ago. I was challenging you on the idea of, can I be a scientist and still do science even though what I'm doing is horrific? Meaning, can I be torturing Jews to learn about hypothermia? Is that science? And so we had a kind of a back and forth, and I felt bad thinking after, so I'm like, no! I was like screaming at you, no, and I shouldn't have done that. I should have been a little bit more, thank you for arguing with my, more set goals. But it was an interesting idea. Can you do that? It might very well be yes. I can be a scientist and still do terrible things and still be doing science. But I was challenging that to get you to think about what science, could there be a definition of science that includes things like value, ethical value, or an ethical component that's not separate from it? Go ahead.
Not to start the argument again, but
Go ahead.
just because it's terrible, like we say do terrible things, but is the adjective really part of science? Like just as
That would be a great adjoinder to that. So you would be saying, well, terrible, I'm already starting with an idea before we even begin with the definition of science, right? This adjective, terrible, does that even play into what science is? And so that's where the conversation would begin again, wouldn't it? If I say, no! And then, or I'd say, yes, because you're asking me about terrible. But that's where we would have our conversation again. Does science have an ethical component implicit within it? Or are these just arbitrary rules that we put on it because it doesn't feel good to know that we torture animals, for instance, to get your makeup? Or we have sweatshops. We create these elaborate scientific systems, these assembly lines, based on thank you for doing science, engineers. And we have these systems that ultimately create income inequality, child labor, all these wonderful, wonderful things as far as getting us to be our little Hunger Games community. What's that world called? I don't remember that city. No, is it called the Capitol? It's just called the Capitol. We're the Capitol. Do you guys get that allegory? I hope you do. We are the Capitol. So is that part of science? To do that, is that what science is? And you're saying, yeah, it could, it's neutral. So that's what I'm asking you to suggest there. And as we do science, not just how do we reason when we do science? So are we, as a species, as a thinker, when we do science, do we reason along with that? And when we reason, what does that look like? When I had you do that experiment just now, or that observation to say, you didn't just observe the things. I told you a paradigm I wanted you to fit it into. That is categorize, or patterns, or I said something that just seems natural to us to do. Is it not natural for the human mind to create patterns? Why? Why is that important to our... We have to associate, so there's a cultural dimension involved with our biology. What else? Straight up survival. You gotta know what, you gotta see through that camouflage. You don't want that lion on the savannah to eat you. So there's patterns there. But what ends up happening is a strange artifact of that. We see rabbits in clouds. We paint pictures in caves. We do all these weird things that no other animal does as a result of our pattern-seeking mind. It's part of our intelligence. But then when we are doing science, meaning as we are observing the world, we're also trying to reason out why we're doing it. And so there's this constant sort of reevaluation, perhaps a reflection on the things that we're doing. And that's where the ethical component comes in. It's like, well, this is science, but this doesn't make me feel right. Or this is science, this is me observing and creating experiments, but I'm producing something terrible. Or this is me doing science, but what am I actually finding? Am I just making the red light turn green and then the green light turn red, and what does that even mean? So I still have to do what with the results that I get? It's part of that scientific method at the very end. What is a conclusion? What is a conclusion?
Just statement based on all parts of
Well, I put it in the machine and it turned from red to green, and then it turned red to green.
It's a judgment made from all parts of the experiment.
So this is our beginning, our use of language to describe what does it actually mean when we interpret results. Okay, what am I trying to produce? Why is it that I would look at, as one scientist tried to defend, the sexual mating patterns of ducks? What would be the point of that? Right? I had this really interesting article that I read that was again a rebuttal to political pressure, saying, why are we even spending money, federal grants, on the sex of ducks? And so the scientist said, because it's science and it's important, and this is what we're doing, and this is why it might be important to the future. So is science an important investment? Those would be all parts of why we interpret certain things the way we do. Is there a reason for it? Is there a reason for the science that we do? Are we trying to move towards an option? I had you guys in 2 weeks ago. Before that, we've been in science for quite some time, with a little break in between. But I asked you to think about some of those serendipity moments, right? Those happy accidents. Were those people trying to create these life-changing, these paradigms in the world? They sometimes were just accidents, and yet is that important to invest even in happy accidents? That's a question also within the framework of TOK. So how do we move towards a framework of knowing, again, which is our idea of paradigms? I want you to consider, this is it from many different levels: science, philosophy, reason, and even ethics involved with this clip here. How many of you guys have seen, I just want to play it, I'm sure you guys know it. Oops. No, I didn't do it. Go back here to see. There we go. Minority Report, have you guys seen that? Minority Report? Yes? Okay, good. So this won't come as a surprise to you. Turn off the lights, please.
Sorry, I need to pause it.
Turn that off. Yeah, turn this. Yeah. Notice some of the little details. Spielberg's great at that.
The gentlemen of justice want to take all this away from us. You understand? In a week from now, people are going to vote on whether or not what we've been doing down here has been some noble-minded enterprise, or a chance to change the way this country finds crime.
I understand, sir.
John, watch this Danny Whitwer, the observer from Justice.
Yes, I met him yesterday.
You can let him look around, answer his questions, but watch him.
Yes,
huh? And if there's any problem, make sure we know about it first.
I understand.
When the precogs declare a victim and a killer, their name is embedded in the grain of wood. Since each piece is unique, the shape and grain is unique. The shape and grain is impossible to forge.
I'm sure you all understand the legalistic drawback to pre-crime methodology.
Here we go again.
Look, I'm not with the ACLU on this, Jeff. But let's not kid ourselves. We are arresting individuals who have broken no law.
But they will. The commission of the crime itself is absolute metaphysics. The precogs see the future, and they're never wrong.
But it's not the future if you stop. Isn't that a fundamental paradox?
Yes, it is. You're talking about predetermination, which happens all the time. Why'd you catch that?
Because it was going to fall.
You're certain?
Yeah.
But it didn't fall. You caught it. The fact that you prevented it from happening doesn't change the fact that it was going to happen.
You ever get any false positives?
All right, turn on the lights there, please. What do you think? Minority Report, great movie. Now the premise, if you're not familiar with the premise of Minority Report, it's they have these people, these three things that they call the precogs, and they basically are kept inside some sort of machine that allows them to determine the future, but it's a specific type of future. It's only murders. And so in Washington, D.C., they've turned it into a murder-free zone because they have these precogs that can determine whether someone's going to commit a murder or not and stop them from doing it. Now the caveat is they convict them as if they were murderers, even though they haven't actually committed the crime. So this is an interesting ethical dilemma. But the question is very, very much a question of reason, connected to science and how science operates in predictive knowing. What was the main question there that you noticed from our character Tom Cruise, Tom Anderton or something, Anderton, John Anderton, in that clip?
The guy who's arguing?
The Tom Cruise character. What was his main argument?
It was going to happen.
He has this allegory, this quick little symbol that he creates with that wood ball flying across the screen. He's catching it. How do you know it was going to fall? Why did you catch it? Because he was certain it was going to fall. In the same way, they believe this precognition, which is in this new reality, this future reality, is a certainty, or at least it seems like one, of course, except it's a great conflict because it's whether or not it's actually a certainty or not. Is there a certain sense of certainty to the world to where we have some sort of obligation to prevent something? How is science used to prevent things? Vaccines is a simple one, right? We use science to prevent things. What else? Fail-safe systems in computers or other types of machinery. Good. Genetic engineering. How does genetic engineering prevent things? Maybe in good ways and bad ways, right? So genetic disorders, that sort of thing. We know it's through gene therapy, we know it's some sort of certainty that this person's going to have some sort of disability. We need to prevent it. Now, is there a component that's beyond science when it comes to controversial things like gene therapy and cloning and those types of stem cell research? Would you say that there's an ethical component? Is that ethical component separate than our knowing of science, or is it somehow involved with science and science can answer it better than anyone else? There's where your conflict lies, right? That's where your attention lies. Now with reason, it's that idea of reasoning towards the future. That's what we do again as pattern seekers. We're also thinking about time. Do you guys realize that cave paintings have spirals in them? And those spirals have been around since the beginning of time, beginning of human civilization. And they happen in common phenomena, which means it happens all across every culture, Native Americans to Europeans to Asian cultures, all the three different major groups. They all have these spirals, and they all represent qualities of time. That we're actually thinking of ourselves not just as beings of past knowing, but of future knowing. That I know myself in the future as well. So can I not prevent something in the future? This is science towards the future, using reason of the past to deduce things in the future. Okay? We don't have knowing in the same way as those precogs, but what are some ways in which we've seen recently the use of science to totally change our views of how we, I guess, interact with the security of our country, or with the security of our towns, I should say? Do you guys have sort of a thought? I'm thinking of one big thing in particular. We had started, I think we had just started science actually when the Boston bombings happened. And I don't think you guys were very old to know about 9/11, but the difference in the way in which social media exists today to create a global a network of security, so different than what we had just 10 years ago. Totally different way of predictive knowing. We were actually able to use an X-ray on some, I don't know if it was a drone or not, but it was some type of aircraft to find the bomber inside a boat. Very interesting. So it kind of went to our ideas of ethics when we talked about that earlier in the year. Anyways, interesting thoughts to have about these. I talked about my Minority Report. Lastly, of course, this gets us always down to the politics. Theory of knowledge would also consider how we are to, as a community, so we're thinking still in cultural terms, this is still number 3 in my original tasks of science, if you remember way back when, is that science kind of interacts seemingly at odds with religion, but also as a community of people. And why is it that there's feelings of clashing going on? And part of it has to do with these politics involved. It can't be that you can teach that the Earth and the universe is one age and another age at the same time, is it? Can you do that? Can you respect everyone's beliefs about science, or do you have to make decisions on what public people know? And is there such a thing as public knowledge? Meaning things that I need you to know in order for me to feel safe, secure, peaceful. Okay. So what misconceptions about science exist within the political way of thinking? Is there misconceptions that you hear in presidential debates or thoughts about science in general from any groups? Is there misconceptions? Let me know. What do you think? Give me an example. Misconceptions about how science exists within the political way of thinking. If I were to think like a politician, is there a misconception about science? You think of a couple. There's the obvious ones. There's the whole controversy with creationism and evolution. So, gay marriage. What about gay marriage and science? Misconception of science.
If you're born like that, it's a lifestyle choice.
So here we have an interesting, is homosexuality some sort of genetic or scientific way of knowing, or is there something more cultural, social involved with it? And so you have various sides actually representing different ways of knowing on that topic, right? Even within the LGBTQ community, even have that long acronym because they're trying to do what? They're trying to be inclusive of various ways in which people identify their own sexuality and then unite together as per some sort of civil rights. What they don't have in there is LGBTQA, which is asexual, because they don't actually, a lot of people don't recognize asexuality as a sexual choice. They think it's a latent homosexuality. It's an interesting tension that goes on in the LGBTQ community. Actually, I have a friend of mine who is part of the LGBTQ community who is critical of things like same-sex marriage because it assumes some sort of paradigm that he rejects outright, which is marriage is the basis for equality in terms of health care and other types of civil rights. He thinks it should be an individual right, not a partnership right. So there's a lot of interesting back and forth with that, and he doesn't necessarily view himself as some sort of scientific experiment. He's not some slave of his genes. He has some other type of element. So interesting complexities involved there. Now, do you hear that type of language, though, in any political conversation on that? What I just said. Have you ever heard that before? You heard that from Obama or from Romney? Obama saying, you know, does he talk like a nuance? No, it's, well, I'm evolving on the issue, but now he's sort of supporting this idea that seems to be a good voting bloc, right? To be quite honest, that's exactly what's going on. The tide is turning. You hear cultural change. But what does that mean? So those are where you would want to talk about misconceptions in science. Is there a quote-unquote gay gene? And how does that, from a reason standpoint, how does that gay gene operate? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Does it mean we can use gene therapy? Is it should gene therapy? Is that terrible? Is that unethical? All of those things are components of that. That'd be a great science and religion topic, gay marriage, right? Or same-sex marriage. Think about education policy. I mentioned the creation-evolution debate, but there would be others as well with that. Bible as literature is an interesting example of that. Think about how voting demographics change. If you have a large segment of your population that has misconceptions about science, do you think your politicians are going to represent that voting bloc? They would better hope so, or else they're not going to get votes, right? So if you hear someone talking about something, I don't like that guy, he's too, you know, whatever, you have issues. And this happens on both sides. You have people who think that science is this great pedestal, you keep it up here, high up, and you have other people who want to dismiss it outright. So this happens on both sides. Global economies, how it is that we look at ourselves competing with other cultures. You might hear it all the time as part of education policy, that we're not producing scientists and engineers like Japan is or China is. And so we have to compete with these other global economies because we don't have a science focus. Okay, so this is another element of that. Environment/business, so I talk about that all the time. I'm going to skip this quote from, this is a 5-minute little clip from Neil deGrasse Tyson. You can look at it online, I know. But he talks about his own opinion on it. He talks about how he thinks where we need to move in terms of politics, but I think it's heavy-handed now that I'm thinking about it. I already did this experiment, what's in the box, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And finally, this is our last thing here, and we'll be done real quick. We've just been talking about our science and religion. If you haven't already watched this segment, this hour and a half or so on the motion Science Refutes God, you need to watch it before your Socratic seminar. I have it in this in the Dropbox folder, and you can look at the conclusion, listen to the 15-minute conclusion. I'm not going to do that to you now, because I said that we'd be out early, and I'm going to give you 15 minutes early, so we will do it. But I want you to figure out what TOK observations can be made with intelligent discussion, which is what this is advertised as, intelligent discussion on topics that are including things like science and religion, because you don't often hear TOK intelligent discussion on important issues. You hear people prattle and stereotype and minimize the other side. So listen to their views and their rebuttals and their summaries. Use that as maybe a springboard to your own research, and come with some sort of thoughtful engagement to Wednesday's Socratic Seminar. It's an important one because the topic itself is pretty important as we summarize and finish up science. So I want you to think about what are some things in a seeming conflict in my task 3 in my science discussion. Science as definition and process, science as community, and science in opposition to other ways of knowing, such as spirituality, emotion, and or religion. So those are the things you're looking at when you do this. And also, just like your Tolman argument, presuppositions. What presuppositions exist within both sides with your people who are tending to have religious knowing versus people who are seeming to be authoritarian in their scientific knowing, meaning science has a supremacy to other ways of knowing. All right, guys. Thank you for your attention. You guys were excellent participants today. Make sure Wednesday you have your Socratic seminars ready.
Is it on there?
We can talk about it. It is on science and religion. That's the motion that we are discussing. Make sure you have questions.
Do we print out the thing, or can we do it on page?
I had a printout of it that I gave out, but it's online. You can print it out. I want you to type it, though. You can use it as notes, but you need to type it and have it submitted digitally. Yeah, make sure you type your...
And send it to you
Yeah, on Dropbox. Yeah, there'll be a Dropbox submission for you. I do want some type of article. Yeah, you want to have something that you discuss that you can read. So each team is doing, each team is doing their own Socratic grouping. So you can choose.
One per
No, each person needs their own sort of Socratic argument, but you can share ideas. So don't. Yeah, it doesn't have to be all different because you're all doing the same topic. It's fine with me.
Bye.
So make sure to describe those subjects, email each other, just describe something. At the very least, have some sort of sub topic of science and religion that you all can research and then come back and surprise each other on even. Bye guys, thanks for coming. I appreciate the full house. Goodbye. Yeah. Sure. You just turn off the order.